From that time Jose Aldo lost a title championship fight in 13 seconds, to several fighters retiring from the UFC after losing a match, the journey of a UFC fighter is a roller coaster ride, to the point where tons of contenders fail to bounce back after being defeated. Starting with the infamous Conor McGregor. I mean, come on, the guy's name is literally synonymous with the UFC, because McGregor rose to fame quickly, winning both the featherweight and lightweight titles in a short period. Yep, that's right, his trash-talking and fighting skills were unmatched. However, his most significant loss was against Khabib Nurmagomedov at UFC 229. McGregor lost the fight via submission in the 4th round, and since then, he hasn't been able to bounce back fully. It's gotten so bad for the big guy that he has won only one of his last 4 fights, and fans are beginning to question whether he'll ever be the same fighter he was before, or if he'll ever fight for a title again. But despite his recent struggles, McGregor is still a massive draw for the UFC, and one of the most recognizable fighters worldwide, because even after all the brutal losses, he continues to train and is still one of the top fighters in the sport. And of course, before McGregor started losing his titles, no one can ever forget the iconic fight between him and Jose Aldo in 2015, which led to the featherweight champion Aldo losing his title. Yep, that's right. Prior to his title loss to Conor McGregor, Aldo had an impressive record of 18-0 in his MMA career, including 8 consecutive title defenses as the UFC featherweight champion. However, he was knocked out by McGregor in just 13 seconds.
At 13 seconds of the very first round, by knockout and
which marked the end of his long reign as the champion. But our boy Aldo wasn't about to give up, because he then moved down to the bantamweight division and worked his way up to a title shot against Petr Yan in 2020, where during the fight, fans could see flashes of his old self. But he was ultimately stopped in the 5th round via technical knockout, losing the fight, but definitely not his spirit. Aldo bounced back with 2 consecutive wins against Marlon Vera and Pedro Munoz. But things have started to go downhill for the fighter recently. On August 20th, 2022, Aldo faced Merab Dvalishvili at UFC 278, and well, things didn't go as planned. He lost the bout via unanimous decision, making fans realize that maybe the fighter won't be bouncing back with wins so often anymore. But even with all the recent losses, he's still considered one of the greatest featherweight fighters of all time. And speaking of featherweight fighters, I can't forget about heavyweight champions. That includes Anthony Johnson, a powerhouse in the UFC's light heavyweight division. The guy was known for his incredible strength and knockout power, and before his title fight against Daniel Cormier at UFC 187, Johnson had won 8 of his last 9 fights. So when I say he's absolutely incredible, I mean it. And not just that, he had knocked out 5 of those opponents in the 1st round. Unfortunately, Johnson was unable to capture the title, losing to Cormier via submission in the 3rd round. Now that's a downer, but our boy didn't give up, because after his loss to Cormier, he won his next 2 fights in a row, and was pretty confident in his skills once again. But boom, a rematch against Cormier was all it took for him to retire.
I don't have any excuses. I lost again to the better man. This was my last fight. It's just time for me to move on to something else. I'm tired of getting punched by guys and rolling around on the ground with guys and stuff like that.
I think he just had enough by that point. After that, he moved on to professional bodybuilding, and is even currently signed with the Bellator MMA promotion. Now that's honestly a very cool comeback instead of challenging their competitor once again. But unlike Johnson, who learned his lesson, Chael Sonnen did exactly that. If you don't know who Chael Sonnen is, then I'll have to say that you're not a real UFC fan. He's popular as one of the most outspoken and controversial fighters in the UFC, and he did something pretty overconfident when he challenged Anderson Silva for the middleweight title at UFC 117. Before the fight, Sonnen had won 3 fights in a row and had been dominant in each of them, so he was pretty confident that he's gonna win. And he almost did win, but Sonnen lost the fight in the 5th round via submission after being ahead on points for most of the fight. That must have been a pretty frustrating loss to deal with, because after the fight, Sonnen just lost his momentum. winning 3 fights and losing 3. But ever since retiring from the UFC, the former athlete has become a commentator and analyst for Bellator MMA. The guy has even started his own podcast. And honestly, it seems to be working out pretty well for him. And let's not forget about Paige VanZant, the fighter who was once a rising star, but struggled to bounce back after her title fight loss to Rose Namajunas in 2016. Before her loss to Namajunas, VanZant had won 4 of her 5 fights in the UFC, including 3 finishes. But let's face it, Namajunas dominated her and she lost via submission in the 5th round. Ouch! After the loss, VanZant moved up to the flyweight division and won her first fight against Bec Rawlings via TKO. Things were looking up. But unfortunately, she lost her next 2 fights against Michelle Waterson and Jessica Rose Clark. She did manage to bounce back with a win over Rachel Ostovich, but lost her last fight in the UFC to Amanda Ribas. Then, in 2020, VanZant left the UFC and signed with the Bare Knuckle Fighting Championship. She made her debut in February of 2021 and lost via unanimous decision to Britton Hart. Despite the loss, though, she still got a fighting spirit and continues to fight in bare knuckle boxing, hoping for a fresh start. But Paige isn't the only fighter who the fans had a lot of hopes from. Joel Luna Zarate also had a lot of potential. Zarate's career started with a bang, with 23 consecutive wins under his belt. But when he challenged Julio Cesar Borboa for the IBF title in 1993, things started going downhill. Despite a spirited effort, Zarate dropped a unanimous decision and missed out on the belt. He didn't give up though, and worked his way back up to a shot at the WBC title in 1998 against Jerry Penalosa. Unfortunately, their fight ended early due to a head clash, resulting in a technical draw in the 2nd round. But Zarate wasn't deterred and tried again in 1999, traveling all the way to Seoul to face Penalosa's conqueror in Ju Cho. But even after all that, Zarate lost in a 12-round majority decision. I mean, that's just unfortunate, because despite a strong start to his career, Joel Luna Zarate couldn't quite seem to bounce back after his first title loss, ultimately going 0-3-1 in title fights. But hey, at least he gave it his all and left it all in the ring. But unlike Zarate, who is able to bounce back after his numerous losses, that wasn't the case with Martin Vargas, who was a junior flyweight and flyweight boxer, and had some great fights against some of the biggest names in the sport. In 1977, Vargas went up against the WBC flyweight champion Miguel Cotto. Although he wasn't able to come out on top, he definitely gave Cotto a run for his money. Unfortunately, Vargas's luck ran out in 1980, when he dropped down to junior flyweight and took on WBA champion Yoko Gushigen in 1980. Gushigen just proved to be too much for Vargas in just 8 rounds. This loss marked Vargas's 4th consecutive defeat, and he was just never able to recover from it. And those are all the title contenders who failed to bounce back following defeat.